Our next lesson in the Civil War is called Lincoln's Last Months. Our objectives for this lesson are to know details of the 1864 election, cite effects made to end the war and plan for Reconstruction, recall Lincoln's second inaugural address, learn about a failed kidnapping attempt following the speech. Look at your vocabulary words. A person's often humorous account of another person or event is an anecdote. To denounce or criticize something as wrong is deprecate. To make something available to every person is integrate. To make legal or right in the eyes of the population is legitimize. To unite two opposing sides is reconcile. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It is not best to swap horses while crossing the river. You can fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all of the time. Abraham Lincoln. These are only 3 quotes from the hundreds attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Which of them is your favorite? The first was written before the Civil War. The second was written just prior to the election of 1864. The third was written as an anecdote about politicians and lawyers in general. From a historical perspective, Lincoln was the right man for the job. Without a doubt, he was flawed, as all human beings are, but he also had the fortitude to make the right decisions in the face of turmoil, and sometimes ridicule. Today's lesson covers the last few months of Lincoln's life, from the 1864 presidential election to shortly after his second inaugural address. Okay, so election of 1864, so this is his second term. As the war dragged on into the winter of 1863, it appeared that Lincoln was not going to be re-elected president. Story after story told of bloody battles with little to show for them. Anti-war factions in the government were constantly calling for an end to the conflict. More and more families were suffering from the loss of loved ones. It was already conceded that if Lincoln lost the election, the new president would sit down at the negotiations table with the Confederacy and hammer out a truce. The deal would legitimize and formally recognize the Confederacy's right to exist as an independent entity. For Lincoln, compromise such as this was out of the question. Therefore, he did everything in his power to see that the Union gained the upper hand on the South. The victories he needed came first in Atlanta and then Savannah at Christmas time in 1863. Sherman's wins cut off any chance of the South winning the war, but more important, they kept the South from winning a critical political victory. Okay, so in your notes, I want you to write today's date, okay, election of 1864. And it said that if Lincoln lost, they expected the new president, because remember, if Lincoln lost, that meant that the other president was for the Confederacy being its own country. So Lincoln knew that if he lost, the new president would negotiate with the South to end the war, and then we would have the North and South would be their own country. So the South would be its own country. For Lincoln, compromise such as this was out of the question. Okay, so he said there were a couple things that happened and ensured that Lincoln would win the war. Lincoln would win the presidency. Okay, victories. The victories that helped Lincoln get elected as president was Atlanta, and Savannah. Okay. The Democrats chose General George McClellan to run against Lincoln for the presidency. It was an odd choice since he favored the war effort. He was very popular with the people, however, and it was felt he had the only chance of unseating the president. Lincoln believed there was a real chance he could lose, and he made a secret pledge to end the war before the next inauguration in the event that happened. Okay. So it says that the South, or the Democrats, so the Democrat candidate was General McClellan. And they said that McClellan was an odd choice because McClellan liked to fight. He was in favor of the war. But the reason the Democrats chose McClellan is because they thought he's the only one that had a chance against Lincoln. Okay, so today we're talking about the election of 1864. If Lincoln lost, the new president would negotiate with the South. The South would be its own country. And Lincoln's whole goal was to keep the Union together. The victories that helped Lincoln win the election were the victories at Atlanta and Savannah. The Democrats' candidate was General McClellan. And we said that McClellan favored the war, but they thought he was the only one that had a chance against Lincoln. The people really liked him. And Lincoln determined if Lincoln lost, he said he would end the war before the inauguration. So Lincoln realized there's a chance that he could lose. At the top, we read a quote, and it says, "It is not best to swap horses while crossing the river," and that's what that was talking about. It's not best to switch presidencies while you're crossing the river. That's what that quote meant. As it turned out, the Democratic Party became fractured before the election, and Lincoln won all but 2 states and 21 electoral votes. Andrew Johnson had the distinction of being his running mate. The election paved the way for continuance of the war to its conclusion, which was the preservation of the Union and to end slavery. Okay, so when it says that Johnson was his running mate, that means that Johnson was his vice president. And it says that Lincoln won all but 2 states. And 21 electoral votes. So he did better on his second election than he did his first election. Remember, the first election when Lincoln was voted in as president, nobody had very many of the votes. It's just there were 3 candidates, and Lincoln had more votes than either one of them. So if he won all but 2 states and all but 21 electoral votes on his second election, he actually did better in his second election than he did his first. And we still said that Lincoln still has the same goals. We wrote it before, but we'll write it again. His goals are to preserve the Union. He wants to keep the Union together and to end slavery. Okay, now we said that McClellan was an odd choice because McClellan favored the war, but they thought he was the only one that had a chance against Lincoln. If Lincoln lost, he said that he would end the war before the inauguration. Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. Lincoln won all but 2 states and 21 electoral votes. Lincoln's goals are still the same, to preserve the Union and to end slavery. War effort. During the entire war, Lincoln stayed as informed as possible about the progress of battles and troop movements. If you remember, there were several times in our lesson where we said that Sherman sent Lincoln a telegraph telling him what was going on. And other generals did the same thing. So they kept him informed. It was not uncommon for him to walk across the street from the White House to spend hours at a telegraph office waiting for news from the front. He understood the only way the South was going to be defeated was if the Union troops destroyed the armies defending her. Although he had trouble early on finding a commanding officer that shared his views, that issue was settled when Ulysses Grant took command. Okay, and we said that communication was a lot less advanced than it is now. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have a lot of the things that we had, but Lincoln still stayed as informed as possible. Lincoln stayed as informed as possible. Lincoln heartily approved of the general, it's talking about Ulysses Grant. Lincoln heartily approved of Grant's war of attrition, bearing the brunt of criticism back home. The bloody stalemates at the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg were tempered with the capturing of Atlanta and Sherman's march to the sea. The end was clearly in sight after 3 long years of bitter struggle. The fine addition of black troops bolstered the Union Army, giving it a distinct military advantage over the South. As losses mounted on both sides, it was the North that was able to replenish their forces, and we talked about that. With the end of the war in sight, Lincoln turned his thoughts to Reconstruction. The devastation caused by war in the South would take a great deal to overcome. More important, however, was the need to reconcile the North and South. There was much bitterness and many differences to work through. So Lincoln didn't want to destroy the South. He didn't want to punish the South after the war. He wanted to help reconstruct the South. So Lincoln realizes when the war's over, the South is going to need a lot of help. Reconstruction. It shows that Lincoln had no bitterness toward the South. His goal was to help the South. I better put of South. Reconstruction of the South, so you know what I'm talking about. Because remember, we talked about how they destroyed their homes, their factories, their railroads. They burnt many towns down. So there's a lot of damage in the South. Views of Reconstruction. As the question of Reconstruction came up in Lincoln's cabinet, there were a number of issues that had to be addressed. Each would have to be considered carefully if healing was to take place in the nation. So not only is he trying to reconstruct the South, he's trying to get the North and South to heal. He's trying to get them to get along, to get over, I don't know if I want to say get over their differences, but no hard feelings between them. The first issue involved integrating the South back into the Union. What kind of requirements or restrictions would be placed on them? Lincoln favored allowing the states back in on 2 conditions: that they would swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, and that at least 10% of the voters wanted to rejoin the Union. This plan did not sit well with radical Republicans who wanted to severely punish the South. Okay, so the first issue that they had to deal with was what restrictions were they going to place on the South? Were they going to let them back in the Union? Okay, South would be allowed to, back in the Union as states that they had under 2 conditions. Number 1, swear oath of allegiance to the U.S. Swear oath of allegiance to U.S. and at least 10% of the voters. This is talking about the voters of the South. 10% of the voters wanted to rejoin the Union. And Lincoln got a lot of slack on this because a lot of the people wanted to punish the South. It says the radical Republicans, but I don't know that it was just them, but radical Republicans wanted to severely punish the South. Okay, Lincoln stayed as informed as possible. We said that he would go and spend hours at the telegraph office waiting for news of what was happening in the war. Reconstruction of the South. Lincoln knew that there were some issues that had to be addressed before he could there could be any reconstruction of the South. The first was the South would be allowed back in the Union as states under two conditions. They'd swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, and 10% of the voters had to want to rejoin the Union. The radical Republicans wanted to severely punish the South, so Lincoln had issues there. Let's talk about the second one. Second, the problem of what to do with former Confederate leaders had to be addressed. Lincoln appeared to be willing to offer amnesty to those who had not harmed Union prisoners, were willing to swear the oath, and had not held office in the Confederacy government. Again, radical Republicans favored harsh penalties and jail time for these offenders. Okay, so this, even after the war's over, it doesn't sound like Lincoln's going to have a very easy time. Okay, so the second issue that has to be addressed Lincoln would offer amnesty to Confederate leaders he's not going to offer amnesty to all the Confederate leaders, just the ones who had not harmed, who hadn't harmed Union prisoners they had to be willing to swear the oath, the oath of allegiance. Who swear the oath had not held office in Confederate government. Okay, and not held office in Confederate government. Okay, so Lincoln would offer amnesty, I forgot my N, to Confederate leaders who hadn't harmed the Union prisoners, who would swear the oath, and who had not held office in the Confederate government. Okay, the radical Republicans still wanted to severely punish them, so they favored harsh penalties. They didn't want to give them amnesty. Favored harsh penalties and jail time. Okay. The third issue, the final issue, was the issue of freed slaves had to be dealt with in a timely manner. Thousands of them were about to be given their freedom, and there would have to be some programs put into place that would accommodate this. They would need employment, education, and housing opportunities. Now remember, they had spent their whole life on the plantation. As a slave, you don't own anything, so they're going to be freed. Where are they going to go? They lived on the plantation. The plantation owners are the ones that fed them. Now they're going to be freed. It's kind of like you're taken to a country and you're dropped off, and you don't know anybody. What are they going to do? Okay, the freed slaves. I'm going to put need accommodations. Accommodations. Okay, we said that they were going to need jobs or employment. They're going to need an education because it was against the law to educate a slave. They weren't allowed to be taught to read. So education and housing. This isn't just one or two people, this is thousands of people. So this was a big issue. Each issue was broad in scope and would be complicated to manage. The path to restoring the Union was going to be a difficult one to travel and would take a great deal of compromise. Lincoln made his views known to the public in his second inaugural address. So we said that the second issue was Lincoln would offer amnesty to Confederate leaders who hadn't harmed the Union prisoners, who would swear the oath, and who had not held office in Confederate government. The radical Republicans favored harsh penalties and jail time. Number 3, the freed slaves would need accommodations, they would need jobs, education, and housing. The last inaugural address. On March 4, 1865, marked the date of Lincoln's second inaugural address in Washington, D.C. Here he gave what is called his favorite speech, although no one knew it would be his last. In it, he spoke about the war. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it, without war seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. So when he says that one of them would make war, he's talking about the South. They fired the first shots of the war. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. He's talking about the North. The North accepted the war because they didn't want the Union to perish. A fairly short speech ended with some of his most famous remarks. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Okay, so we talked about Lincoln's last inaugural address. Okay, Lincoln's last inaugural address. And that was on March 4th, 1865. You'll notice with this speech, if you look at it, it's not very long. Lincoln's speeches were short and to the point. And at the end of that speech, he talked about not having bitterness toward each other. He said we should have love for everyone. I think Lincoln had a Christian heart. You can tell he had a perfect heart, because through all this, he didn't hate the South. He wanted to help the South. Okay, kidnapping attempt. Neither Lincoln nor anyone else could have known that his future assassin was in the audience just a few yards away. The act at Ford's Theater 40 days later would actually be the second attempt to harm the president. 13 days after Lincoln's speech, John Wilkes Booth and other conspirators decided to kidnap Lincoln as he attended a play at a hospital. The group hid along the road Lincoln was to travel, but he never showed up. As it turned out, the president had changed his plans at the last minute and did not attend the play. Okay, so kidnapping attempt. That might be something you didn't know about. Kidnapping attempt. It says it was 13 days after his speech, after that second inaugural address. It was John Wilkes Booth, so it's the same guy. They decided to kidnap Lincoln. Let me erase this. Okay, they were going to kidnap Lincoln. While attended a play at a hospital. Said they hid along the road. But it said Lincoln never showed up. Okay. So we said Lincoln's last inaugural address was on March 4th, 1865. He talked about even though the Confederates started the war, we shouldn't have any hatred toward them. We need to help them. We need to love them. Kidnapping attempt. 13 days after the speech, John Wilkes Booth and his friends, his other conspirators, were going to kidnap Lincoln while he attended a play at a hospital. My goodness. Forgot my N. They hid along the road, but Lincoln never showed up. So let's review what we learned today. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. For a time, it appeared Lincoln would not be re-elected president. However, victories in Atlanta and Savannah and the siege of Lee's army swung the election to his side in convincing fashion. General George McClellan ran against him, and Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's running mate. Lincoln stayed heavily involved in the war effort, approving of Grant's war of attrition. There were three main issues to address once the war ended. They were the manner in which Southern states would be integrated into the Union, the way former Confederate leaders would be treated, the programs that would be needed to employ, educate, and house freed slaves. Lincoln's second inaugural address was his favorite speech. In it, he made it known that he desired America to put aside differences and quickly heal the many wounds caused by secession and the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth attempted to kidnap President Lincoln shortly after the address, only to be foiled when Lincoln changed his plans at the last minute. Okay, go ahead and study your notes, review this lesson, and answer the questions.